War and Peace, Book 11, Chapter 11, read for LibriVox.org by Geneva. In the middle of this fresh tale, Pierre was summoned to Commander-in-Chief. When he entered the private room, Count Rostopchin, puckering his face, was rubbing his forehead and eyes with his hand. A short man was saying something, but when Pierre entered, he stopped speaking and went out. "Oh, how do you do, great warrior?" said Rostopchin as soon as the short man had left the room. "We have heard of your prowess, but that's not the point. Between ourselves, mon cher, do you belong to the Masons?" He went on severely, as though there was something wrong about it, which he nevertheless intended to pardon. Pierre remained silent. "I am well informed, my friend, but I am aware that they are Masons, and I hope that you are not one of those who on pretence of saving mankind wish to ruin Russia." "Yes, I am a Mason," Pierre replied. "There you see, monsieur. I expect you know that Messieurs Speransky and Magnitsky have been deported to their proper place. Mr. Khrushchev has been treated in the same way, and so have others who on the plea of building up the Temple of Solomon have tried to destroy the temple of their fatherland. You can understand that there are reasons for this, and that I could not have exiled the postmaster had he not been a harmful person. It has now come to my knowledge that you lent him your carriage for his removal from town, and that you have even accepted papers from him for safe custody. I like you and don't wish you any harm, and, as you are only half my age, I advise you, as a father would, to cease all communication with men of that stamp and to leave here as soon as possible." "But what did Khrushchev do wrong, Count?" asked Pierre. "That is for me to know, but not for you to ask," shouted Rostopchin. "If he is accused of circulating Napoleon's proclamation, it is not proved that he did so," said Pierre without looking at Rostopchin, "and Vereshchagin—" "There we are!" Rostopchin shouted at Pierre louder than before, frowning suddenly. "Vereshchagin is a renegade and a traitor who will be punished as he deserves," said he with the vindictive heat with which people speak when recalling an insult. "But I did not summon you to discuss my actions, but to give you advice, or an order, if you prefer it. I beg you to leave the town and break off all communication with such men as Khrushchev, and I will knock the nonsense out of anybody." But probably realizing that he was shouting at Bezúkhov, who so far was not guilty of anything, he added, taking Pierre's hand in a friendly manner, "We are on the eve of a public disaster, and I haven't time to be polite to everybody who has business with me. My head is sometimes in a whirl. Well, mon cher, what are you doing personally?" "Why, nothing," answered Pierre without raising his eyes or changing the thoughtful expression on his face. The Count frowned. "A word of friendly advice, mon cher. Be off as soon as you can. That's all I have to tell you. Happy he who has ears to hear. Good-bye, my dear fellow. Oh, by the by," he shouted through the doorway after Pierre, "is it true that the Countess has fallen into the clutches of the Holy Fathers of the Society of Jesus?" Pierre did not answer and left Rostopchin's room, more sullen and angry than he had ever before shown himself. When he reached home it was already getting dark. Some 8 people had come to see him that evening: the secretary of a committee, the colonel of his battalion, his steward, his major domo, and various petitioners. They all had business with Pierre and wanted decisions from him. Pierre did not understand and was not interested in any of these questions, and only answered them in order to get rid of these people. When left alone at last, he opened and read his wife's letter. "They, the soldiers at the battery. Prince Andrew killed. That old man. Simplicity is submission to God. Suffering is necessary. The meaning of all. One must harness. My wife is getting married. One must forget and understand." And going to his bed, he threw himself on it, without undressing, and immediately fell asleep. When he awoke next morning, the major domo came to inform him that a special messenger, a police officer, had come from Count Rostopchin to know whether Count Bezúkhov had left or was leaving the town. A dozen persons who had business with Pierre were waiting him in the drawing-room. Pierre dressed hurriedly and, instead of going to see them, went to the back porch and out through the gate. From that time till the end of the destruction of Moscow, no one of Bezukhov's household, despite all the search they made, saw Pierre again or knew where he was. End of chapter 11.
War and Peace, Book 11, Chapter 12. Read for LibriVox.org by Paul McCartan. The Rostovs remained in Moscow till the 1st of September, that is, till the eve of the enemy's entry into the city. After Petya had joined Obolensky's regiment of Cossacks and left for Belaya-Sirkov, where that regiment was forming, the Countess was seized with terror. The thought that both her sons were at the war, had both gone from under her wing, that today or tomorrow either or both of them might be killed like the 3 sons of one of her acquaintances, struck her that summer, for the first time, with cruel clearness. She tried to get Nicholas back, and wished to go herself to join Petya, or to get him an appointment somewhere in Petersburg. But neither of these proved possible. Petya could not return unless his regiment did so, or unless he was transferred to another regiment on active service. Nicholas was somewhere with the army, and had not sent a word since his last letter, in which he had given a detailed account of his meeting with Princess Mary. The Countess did not sleep at night, or when she did fall asleep, dreamed that she saw her sons lying dead. After many consultations and conversations, the Count at last devised means to tranquilize her. He got Petya transferred from Obolensky's regiment to Bezukhov's, which was in training near Moscow. Though Petya would remain in the service, this transfer would give the Countess the consolation of seeing at least one of her sons under her wing, and she hoped to arrange matters for her Petya so as not to let him go again, but always get him appointed to places where he could not possibly take part in the battle. As long as Nicholas alone was in danger, the Countess imagined that she loved her firstborn more than all her other children, and even reproached herself for it. But when her youngest, the scapegrace who had been bad at lessons, was always breaking things in the house and making himself a nuisance to everybody, that snub-nosed Petya with his merry black eyes and fresh rosy cheeks, where soft down was just beginning to show, when he was thrown amid those big, dreadful, cruel men who were fighting somewhere about something, and apparently finding pleasure in it, then his mother thought she loved him more, much more, than all her other children. The nearer the time came for Petya to return, the more uneasy grew the Countess. She began to think she would never live to see such happiness. The presence of Sonia, of her beloved Natasha, or even of her husband, irritated her. "What do I want with them? I want no one but Petya," she thought. At the end of August, the Rostovs received another letter from Nicholas. He wrote from the province of Voronezh, where he had been sent to procure remounts. But that letter did not set the Countess at ease. Knowing that one son was out of danger, she became the more anxious about Petya. Though by the 20th of August, nearly all of the Rostovs' acquaintances had left Moscow, and though everybody tried to persuade the Countess to get away as quickly as possible, she would not bear of leaving before her treasure, her adored Petya, returned. On the 28th of August he arrived. The passionate tenderness with which his mother received him did not please the 16-year-old officer. though she concealed from him her intention of keeping him under her wing, Pétya guessed her designs, and instinctively fearing that he might give way to emotion when with her, might become womanish, as he termed it to himself, he treated her coldly, avoided her, and during his stay in Moscow attached himself exclusively to Natasha, for whom he had always had a particularly brotherly tenderness, almost lover-like. Owing to the Count's customary carelessness, nothing was ready for their departure by the 28th of August, and the carts that were to come from their Ryazan and Moscow estates to remove their household belongings did not arrive till the 30th. From the 28th till the 31st, all Moscow was in a bustle and commotion. Every day, thousands of men wounded at Borodino were brought in by the Dorogomilov gate and taken to various parts of Moscow, and thousands of carts conveyed the inhabitants and their possessions out by the other gates. In spite of Rostopchin's broadsheets, or because of them, or independently of them, the strangest and most contradictory rumours were current in the town. Some said that no one was to be allowed to leave the city. Others, on the contrary, said that all the icons had been taken out of the churches and everybody was to be ordered to leave. Some said there had been another battle after Borodino, at which the French had been routed, while others, on the contrary, reported that the Russian army had been destroyed. Some talked about the Moscow militia which, preceded by the clergy, would go to the Three Hills. Others whispered that Augustin had been forbidden to leave, that traitors had been seized, that the peasants were rioting and robbing people on their way from Moscow, and so on. But all this was only talk. In reality, though the Council of Philly, at which it was decided to abandon Moscow, had not yet been held, both those who went away and those who remained behind felt, though they did not show it, that Moscow would certainly be abandoned, and that they ought to get away as quickly as possible and save their belongings. It was felt that everything would suddenly break up and change, but up to the 1st of September, nothing had done so. As a criminal who is being led to execution knows that he must die immediately, but yet looks about him and straightens the cap that is awry on his head, so Moscow involuntarily continued its wonted life, though it knew that the time of its destruction was near, when the conditions of life to which its people were accustomed to submit would be completely upset. During the 3 days preceding the occupation of Moscow, the whole Rostov family was absorbed in various activities. The head of the family, Count Ilya Rostov, continually drove about the city, collecting the current rumours from all sides, and gave superficial and hasty orders at home about the preparations for their departure. The Countess watched the things being packed, was dissatisfied with everything, was constantly in pursuit of Pétya, who was always running away from her, and was jealous of Natasha, with whom he spent all his time. Sonia alone directed the practical side of matters by getting things packed. But of late, Sonia had been particularly sad and silent. Nicholas's letter, in which he mentioned Princess Mary, had elicited, in her presence, joyous comments from the Countess, who saw an intervention of Providence in this meeting of the Princess and Nicholas. "I was never pleased at Bolkonsky's engagement to Natasha," said the Countess, "but I always wanted Nicholas to marry the Princess, and had a presentiment that it would happen. What a good thing it would be!" Sonia felt that this was true, that the only possibility of retrieving the Rostovs' affairs was by Nicholas marrying a rich woman, and that the princess was a good match. It was very bitter for her. But despite her grief, or perhaps just because of it, she took on herself all the difficult work of directing the storing and packing of their things, and was busy for whole days. The Count and Countess turned to her when they had any orders to give. Petya and Natasha, on the contrary, far from helping their parents, were generally a nuisance and hindrance to everyone. Almost all day long the house resounded with their running feet, their cries, and their spontaneous laughter. They laughed and were gay, not because there was any reason to laugh, but because gaiety and mirth were in their hearts, and so everything that happened was a cause for gaiety and laughter to them. Petya was in high spirits, because having left home a boy, he had returned, as everybody told him, a fine young man. Because he was at home, because he had left Belayas-Serkov, where there was no hope of soon taking part in a battle, and had come to Moscow, where there was to be fighting in a few days. And chiefly because Natasha, whose lead he always followed, was in high spirits. Natasha was gay because she had been sad too long, and now nothing reminded her of the cause of her sadness, and because she was feeling well. She was also happy because she had someone to adore her. The adoration of others was a lubricant the wheels of her machine needed to make them run freely, and Petya adored her. Above all, they were gay because there was a war near Moscow. There would be fighting at the town gates. Arms were being given out. Everybody was escaping, going away somewhere, and in general something extraordinary was happening, and that is always exciting, especially to the young. End of chapter 12. Recording by Paul McCartan in Waterford, Ireland, February 2009.
War and Peace, Book 11, Chapter 13, read for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. On Saturday, the 31st of August, everything in the Rostovs' house seemed topsy-turvy. All the doors were open, all the furniture was being carried out or moved about, and the mirrors and pictures had been taken down. There were trunks in the rooms, and hay, wrapping paper, and ropes were scattered about. The peasants and house serfs carrying out the things were treading heavily on the parquet floors. The yard was crowded with peasant carts, some loaded high and already corded up, others still empty. The voices and footsteps of the many servants and of the peasants who had come with the carts resounded as they shouted to one another in the yard and in the house. The count had been out since morning. The countess had a headache brought on by all the noise and turmoil, and was lying down in the new sitting room with a vinegar compress on her head. Petya was not at home. He had gone to visit a friend with whom he meant to obtain a transfer from the militia to the active army. Sónya was in the ballroom looking after the packing of the glass and china. Natásha was sitting on the floor of her dismantled room, with dresses, ribbons, and scarves strewn all about her, gazing fixedly at the floor and holding in her hands the old ball dress, already out of fashion, which she had worn at her first Petersburg ball. Natásha was ashamed of doing nothing when everyone else was so busy, and several times that morning had tried to set to work, but her heart was not in it, and she could not and did not know how to do anything except with all her heart and all her might. For a while she had stood beside Sónya while the china was being packed and tried to help, but soon gave it up and went to her room to pack her own things. At first she found it amusing to give away dresses and ribbons to the maids, but when that was done and what was left had still to be packed, she found it dull. "Dunyásha, you pack. You will, won't you, dear?" And when Dunyásha willingly promised to do it all for her, Natásha sat down on the floor, took her old ball dress, and fell into a reverie quite unrelated to what ought to have occupied her thoughts now. She was roused from her reverie by the talk of the maids in the next room, which was theirs, and by the sound of their hurried footsteps going to the back porch. Natásha got up and looked out of the window. An enormously long row of carts full of wounded men had stopped in the street. The housekeeper, the old nurse, the cooks, coachmen, maids, footmen, postilions, and scullions stood at the gate staring at the wounded. Natásha, throwing a clean pocket-handkerchief over her hair and holding an end of it in each hand, went out into the street. The former housekeeper, old Mavra Kuzminichna, had stepped out of the crowd by the gate, gone up to a cart with a hood constructed of bast mats, and was speaking to a pale young officer who lay inside. Natásha moved a few steps forward and stopped shyly, still holding her handkerchief, and listened to what the housekeeper was saying. "Then you have nobody in Moscow?" she was saying. "You would be more comfortable somewhere in a house. In ours, for instance. The family are leaving." "I don't know if it would be allowed," replied the officer in a weak voice. "Here is our commanding officer. Ask him." And he pointed to a stout major who was walking back along the street past the row of carts. Natásha glanced with frightened eyes at the face of the wounded officer and at once went to meet the major. "May the wounded man stay in our house?" she asked. The major raised his hand to his cap with a smile. "Which one do you want, Mamselle?" said he, screwing up his eyes and smiling. Natásha quietly repeated her question, and her face and whole manner were so serious, though she was still holding the ends of her handkerchief, that the major ceased smiling, and after some reflection, as if considering in how far the thing was possible, replied in the affirmative. "Oh yes, why not? They may," he said. With a slight inclination of her head, Natásha stepped back quickly to Mavra Kuzminichna, who stood talking compassionately to the officer. "They may, he says they may," whispered Natásha. The cart in which the officer lay was turned into the Rostovs' yard, and dozens of carts with wounded men began at the invitation of the townsfolk to turn into the yards and to draw up at the entrances of the houses in Povarskaya Street. Natásha was evidently pleased to be dealing with new people outside the ordinary routine of her life. She and Mavra Kuzminichna tried to get as many of the wounded as possible into their yard. "Your papa must be told though," said Mavra Kuzminichna. Never mind, what does it matter? For one day we can move into the drawing room. They can have all our half of the house." "There now, young lady, you do take things into your head. Even if we put them into the wing, the men's room, or the nurses' room, we must ask permission." "Well, I will ask." Natásha ran into the house and went on tiptoe through the half-open door into the sitting-room, where there was a smell of vinegar and Hoffman's drops. "Are you asleep, Mamma?" "Oh, what sleep?" said the countess, waking up just as she was dropping into a doze. "Mamma, darling," said Natásha, kneeling by her mother and bringing her face close to her mother's. "I am sorry, forgive me. I will never do it again. I woke you up. Mavra Kuzminichna had sent me. They have brought some wounded here, officers. Will you let them come? They have nowhere to go. I knew you would let them come," she said quickly, all in one breath. "What officers? Whom have they brought? I don't understand anything about it," said the countess. Natásha laughed, and the countess too smiled slightly. "I knew you would give permission, so I will tell them." And having kissed her mother, Natásha got up and went to the door. In the hall she met her father, who had returned with bad news. "We have stayed too long," said the count with involuntary vexation. "The club is closed and the police are leaving." "Papa, is it all right? I have invited some of the wounded into the house," said Natásha. "Of course it is," he answered absently. "That is not the point. I beg you not to indulge in trifles now, but to help to pack, and tomorrow we must go. Go, go!" And the count gave a similar order to the major domo and the servants. At dinner, Pétya, having returned home, told them the news he had heard. He said the people had been getting arms in the Krémlin, and that though Rostopchín's broadsheet had said that he would sound a call 2 or 3 days in advance, the order had certainly already been given for everyone to go armed to the Three Hills tomorrow, and that there would be a big battle there. The countess looked with timid horror at her son's eager, excited face as he said this. She realized that if she said a word about his not going to the battle (she knew he enjoyed the thought of the impending engagement), he would say something about man, honor, and the fatherland, something senseless, masculine, and obstinate, which there would be no contradicting, and her plans would be spoiled, and so, hoping to arrange to leave before then and take Pétya with her as their protector and defender, she did not answer him, but after dinner called the count aside and implored him with tears to take her away quickly, that very night if possible. With a woman's involuntary loving cunning, she, who till then had not shown any alarm, said that she would die of fright if they did not leave that very night. Without any pretense, she was now afraid of everything. End of chapter 13. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. War and Peace, Book 11, Chapter 14. Recording for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Madame Schoss, who had been out to visit her daughter, increased the countess's fears still more by telling her what she had seen at a spirit dealer's in Myasnitsky Street. When returning by that street, she had been unable to pass because of a drunken crowd rioting in front of the shop. She had taken a cab and driven home by a side street, and the cabman had told her that the people were breaking open the barrels at the drink store, having received orders to do so. After dinner, the whole Rostov household set to work with enthusiastic haste, packing their belongings and preparing for their departure. The old count, suddenly setting to work, kept passing from the yard to the house and back again, shouting confused instructions to the hurrying people and flurrying them still more. Pétya directed things in the yard. Sónya, owing to the count's contradictory orders, lost her head and did not know what to do. The servants ran noisily about the house and yard, shouting and disputing. Natásha, with the ardor characteristic of all she did, suddenly set to work too. At first her intervention in the business of packing was received skeptically. Everybody expected some prank from her and did not wish to obey her. But she resolutely and passionately demanded obedience, grew angry and nearly cried because they did not heed her, and at last succeeded in making them believe her. Her first exploit, which cost her immense effort and established her authority, was the packing of the carpets. The Count had valuable Gobelin tapestries and Persian carpets in the house. When Natásha set to work, 2 cases were standing open in the ballroom, one almost full up with crockery, the other with carpets. There was also much china standing on the tables, and still more was being brought in from the storeroom. A 3rd case was needed, and servants had gone to fetch it. "Sónya, wait a bit, we'll pack everything into these," said Natásha. "You can't, miss, we have tried to," said the butler's assistant. "No, wait a minute, please." And Natásha began rapidly taking out of the case dishes and plates wrapped in paper. "The dishes must go in here among the carpets," said she. "Why, it is a mercy if we can get the carpets alone into 3 cases," said the butler's assistant. "Oh, wait, please," and Natásha began rapidly and deftly sorting out the things. "These aren't needed," said she, putting aside some plates of Kiev ware. "These, yes, these must go among the carpets," she said, referring to the Saxony china dishes. "Don't, Natásha, leave it alone. We'll get it all packed," urged Sónya reproachfully. "What a young lady she is!" remarked the major domo. But Natásha would not give in. She turned everything out and began quickly repacking, deciding that the inferior Russian carpets and unnecessary crockery should not be taken at all. When everything had been taken out of the cases, they recommenced packing, and it turned out that when the cheaper things not worth taking had nearly all been rejected, the valuable ones really did all go into the 2 cases. Only the lid of the case containing the carpets would not shut down. A few more things might have been taken out, but Natásha insisted on having her own way. She packed, repacked, pressed, made the butler's assistant and Pétya, whom she had drawn into the business of packing, press on the lid, and made desperate efforts herself. "That's enough, Natásha," said Sónya. "I see you were right, but just take out the top one." "I won't!" cried Natásha, with one hand holding back the hair that hung over her perspiring face, while with the other she pressed down the carpets. "Now press, Pétya, press, Vasílich, press hard!" she cried. The carpets yielded and the lid closed. Natásha, clapping her hands, screamed with delight and tears fell from her eyes. But this only lasted a moment. She at once set to work afresh, and they now trusted her completely. The count was not angry even when they told him that Natásha had countermanded an order of his, and the servants now came to her to ask whether a cart was sufficiently loaded and whether it might be corded up. Thanks to Natásha's directions, the work now went on expeditiously, unnecessary things were left, and the most valuable packed as compactly as possible. But hard as they all worked, till quite late that night, they could not get everything packed. The countess had fallen asleep, and the count, having put off their departure till next morning, went to bed. Sónya and Natásha slept in the sitting room without undressing. That night another wounded man was driven down the Povarskaya, and Mavra Kuzminichna, who was standing at the gate, had him brought into the Rostovs' yard. Mavra Kuzminichna concluded that he was a very important man. He was being conveyed in a calèche with a raised hood and was quite covered by an apron. On the box beside the driver sat a venerable old attendant. A doctor and 2 soldiers followed the carriage in a cart. "Please come in here. The masters are going away and the whole house will be empty," said the old woman to the old attendant. "Well, perhaps," said he with a sigh. "We don't expect to get him home alive. We have a house of our own in Moscow, but it is a long way from here, and there's nobody living in it. Do us the honor to come in. There is plenty of everything in the master's house. Come in," said Mavra Kuzminichna. "Is he very ill?" she asked. The attendant made a hopeless gesture. "We don't expect to get him home. We must ask the doctor." And the old servant got down from the box and went up to the cart. "All right," said the doctor. The old servant returned to the calèche, looked into it, shook his head disconsolately, told the driver to turn into the yard, and stopped beside Mavra Kuzminichna. "Oh, Lord Jesus Christ!" she murmured. She invited them to take the wounded man into the house. "The masters won't object," she said. But they had to avoid carrying the man upstairs, and so they took him into the wing and put him in the room that had been Madame Schoss's. This wounded man was Prince Andrew Bolkonsky. End of chapter 14. Recording by Eva Harnick. War and Peace. Book 11, Chapter 15. Recording for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Moscow's last day had come. It was a clear, bright autumn day, a Sunday. The church bells everywhere were ringing for service, just as usual on Sundays. Nobody seemed yet to realize what awaited the city. Only 2 things indicated the social condition of Moscow: the rabble, that is the poor people, and the price of commodities. An enormous crowd of factory hands, house serfs, and peasants, with whom some officials, seminarists, and gentry were mingled, had gone early that morning to the 3 Hills. Having waited there for Rostopchín, who did not turn up, they became convinced that Moscow would be surrendered, and then dispersed all about the town to the public houses and cookshops. Prices too that day indicated the state of affairs. The price of weapons, of gold, of carts and horses kept rising, but the value of paper money and city articles kept falling, so that by midday there were instances of carters removing valuable goods such as cloths and receiving in payment a half of what they carted, while peasant horses were fetching 500 rubles each, and furniture, mirrors, and bronzes were being given away for nothing. In the Rostovs' staid old-fashioned house the dissolution of former conditions of life was but little noticeable. As to the serfs, the only indication was that 3 out of their huge retinue disappeared during the night, but nothing was stolen. And as to the value of their possessions, the 30 peasant carts that had come in from their estates, and which many people envied, proved to be extremely valuable, and they were offered enormous sums of money for them. Not only were huge sums offered for the horses and carts, but on the previous evening and early in the morning of the 1st of September, orderlies and servants sent by wounded officers came to the Rostovs, and wounded men dragged themselves there from the Rostovs and from neighboring houses where they were accommodated, entreating the servants to try to get them a lift out of Moscow. The major domo, to whom these entreaties were addressed, though he was sorry for the wounded, resolutely refused, saying that he dared not even mention the matter to the count. Pity these wounded men as one might, it was evident that if they were given one cart there would be no reason to refuse another, or all the carts and one's own carriages as well. 30 carts could not save all the wounded, and in the general catastrophe one could not disregard oneself and one's own family. So thought the major domo on his master's behalf. On waking up that morning, Count Ilyá Rostov left his bedroom softly, so as not to wake the countess, who had fallen asleep only toward morning, and came out to the porch in his lilac dressing gown. In the yard stood the carts ready corded. The carriages were at the front porch. The major domo stood at the porch talking to an elderly orderly and a pale young officer with a bandaged arm. On seeing the count, the major domo made a significant and stern gesture to them both to go away. "Well, Vasílich, is everything ready?" asked the count, and stroking his bald head, he looked good-naturedly at the officer and the orderly and nodded to them. He liked to see new faces. "We can harness at once, your Excellency." "Well, that is right. As soon as the countess wakes, we'll be off, God willing. What is it, gentlemen?" he added, turning to the officer. "Are you staying in my house?" The officer came nearer and suddenly his face flushed crimson. "Count, be so good as to allow me, for God's sake, to get into some corner of one of your carts. I have nothing here with me. I shall be all right on a loaded cart." Before the officer had finished speaking, the orderly made the same request on behalf of his master. "Oh, yes, yes, yes," said the count hastily. "I shall be very pleased, very pleased. Vasílich, you see to it. Just unload 1 or 2 carts. Well, what of it? Do what is necessary," said the count, muttering some indefinite order. But at the same moment an expression of warm gratitude on the officer's face had already sealed the order. The count looked around him. In the yard, at the gates, at the window of the wings, wounded officers and their orderlies were to be seen. They were all looking at the count and moving toward the porch. "Please step into the gallery, your Excellency," said the major domo. "What are your orders about the pictures?" The count went into the house with him, repeating his order not to refuse the wounded who asked for a lift. "Well, never mind, some of the things can be unloaded," he added in a soft, confidential voice, as though afraid of being overheard. At 9 o'clock the countess woke up, and Matrëna Timoféevna, who had been her lady's maid before her marriage and now performed a sort of chief gendarme's duty for her, came to say that Madame Schoss was much offended and the young lady's summer dresses could not be left behind. On inquiry, the countess learned that Madame Schoss was offended because her trunk had been taken down from its cart, and all the loads were being uncorded and the luggage taken out of the carts to make room for wounded men whom the count, in the simplicity of his heart, had ordered that they should take with them. The countess sent for her husband. "What is this, my dear? I hear that the luggage is being unloaded." "You know, love, I wanted to tell you. Countess dear, an officer came to me to ask for a few carts for the wounded. After all, ours are things that can be bought, but think what being left behind means to them. Really now, in our own yard, we asked them in ourselves, and there are officers among them. You know, I think, my dear, let them be taken. Where is the hurry?" The count spoke timidly, as he always did when talking of money matters. The countess was accustomed to this tone as a precursor of news of something detrimental to the children's interests, such as the building of a new gallery or conservatory, the inauguration of a private theater or an orchestra. She was accustomed always to oppose anything announced in that timid tone, and considered it her duty to do so. She assumed her dolefully submissive manner and said to her husband: "Listen to me, Count. You have managed matters so that we are getting nothing for the house, and now you wish to throw away all the children's property. You said yourself that we have 100,000 rubles worth of things in the house." "I don't consent, my dear. I don't. Do as you please." "It is the government's business to look after the wounded. They know that. Look at the Lopukins opposite. They cleared out everything 2 days ago. That is what other people do. It is only we who are such fools. If you have no pity on me, have some for the children." Flourishing his arms in despair, the count left the room without replying. "Papa, what are you doing that for?" asked Natásha, who had followed him into her mother's room. "Nothing. What business is it of yours?" muttered the count angrily. "But I heard," said Natásha. "Why does Mamma object?" "What business is it of yours?" cried the count. Natásha stepped up to the window and pondered. "Papa, here is Berg coming to see us," said she, looking out of the window. End of chapter 15. Recording by Eva Harnik, Pontevedra, Florida. War and Peace. Book 11, Chapter 16. Recording for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnik. Berg, the Rostovs' son-in-law, was already colonel, wearing the orders of Vladimir and Anna, and he still filled the quiet and agreeable post of assistant to the head of the staff of the assistant commander of the 1st Division of the 2nd Army. On the 1st of September he had come to Moscow from the army. He had nothing to do in Moscow, but he had noticed that everyone in the army was asking for leave to visit Moscow and had something to do there. So he considered it necessary to ask for leave of absence for family and domestic reasons. Berg drove up to his father-in-law's house in his spruce little trap with a pair of sleek roans exactly like those of a certain prince. He looked attentively at the carts in the yard, and while going up to the porch took out a clean pocket handkerchief and tied a knot in it. From the anteroom Berg ran with smooth though impatient steps into the drawing-room, where he embraced the count, kissed the hands of Natásha and Sónya, and hastened to inquire after Mamma's health. "Health at a time like this," said the count. "Come, tell us the news. Is the army retreating, or will there be another battle?" "God Almighty alone can decide the fate of our fatherland, Papa," said Berg. "The army is burning with a spirit of heroism, and the leaders, so to say, have now assembled in council. No one knows what is coming. But in general I can tell you, Papa, that such a heroic spirit, the truly antique valor of the Russian army, which it, he corrected himself, has shown or displayed in the battle of the 26th, there are no words worthy to do it justice. I tell you, Papa." He smote himself on the breast as a general he had heard speaking had done. But Berg did it a trifle late, for he should have struck his breast at the words "Russian army." "I tell you frankly that we, the commanders, far from having to urge the men on or anything of that kind, could hardly restrain those exploits of antique valor," he went on rapidly. "General Barclay de Tolly risked his life everywhere at the head of the troops, I can assure you. Our corps was stationed on a hillside, you can imagine." And Berg related all that he remembered of the various tales he had heard those days. Natásha watched him with an intent gaze that confused him, as if she were trying to find in his face the answer to some question. "Altogether such heroism as was displayed by the Russian warriors cannot be imagined or adequately praised," said Berg, glancing round at Natásha as if anxious to conciliate her, replying to her intent look with a smile. "Russia is not in Moscow. She lives in the hearts of her sons." "Isn't it so, Papa?" said he. Just then the countess came in from the sitting-room with a weary and dissatisfied expression. Berg hurriedly jumped up, kissed her hand, asked about her health, and, swaying his head from side to side to express sympathy, remained standing beside her. "Yes, Mamma, I tell you sincerely that these are hard and sad times for every Russian. But why are you so anxious? You have still time to get away." "I can't think what the servants are about," said the countess, turning to her husband. "I have just been told that nothing is ready yet. Somebody after all must see to things. One misses Mítenka at such times. There won't be any end to it." The count was about to say something, but evidently restrained himself. He got up from his chair and went to the door. At that moment Berg drew out his handkerchief as if to blow his nose, and seeing the knot in it, pondered, shaking his head sadly and significantly. "And I have a great favor to ask of you, Papa," said he. "Hm!" said the count and stopped. "I was driving past Yusúpov's house just now," said Berg with a laugh, "when the steward, a man I know, ran out and asked me whether I wouldn't buy something. I went in out of curiosity, you know, and there is a small chiffonier and a dressing table. You know how dear Véra wanted a chiffonier like that, and how we had a dispute about it." At the mention of the chiffonier and dressing table, Berg involuntarily changed his tone to one of pleasure at his admirable domestic arrangements. "And it is such a beauty. It pulls out and has a secret English drawer, you know. And dear Véra has long wanted one. I wish to give her a surprise, you see. I saw so many of those peasant carts in your yard. Please let me have one. I will pay the man well and—" The count frowned and coughed. "Ask the countess. I don't give orders." "If it is inconvenient, please don't," said Berg. "Only I so wanted it for dear Véra's sake." "Oh, go to the devil, all of you! To the devil, the devil, the devil!" cried the old count. "My head is in a whirl." And he left the room. The countess began to cry. "Yes, Mamma, yes, these are very hard times," said Berg. Natásha left the room with her father, and, as if finding it difficult to reach some decision, first followed him and then ran downstairs. Pétya was in the porch, engaged in giving out weapons to the servants who were to leave Moscow. The loaded carts were still standing in the yard. 2 of them had been uncorded, and the wounded officer was climbing into one of them, helped by an orderly. "Do you know what it is about?" Pétya asked Natásha. She understood that he meant what were their parents quarreling about. She did not answer. "It is because Papa wanted to give up all the carts to the wounded," said Pétya. "Vasílich told me. I consider..." Natásha suddenly almost shouted, turning her angry face to Pétya. "I consider it so horrid, so abominable, so... I don't know what. Are we despicable Germans?" Her throat quivered with convulsive sobs, and afraid of weakening and letting the force of her anger run to waste, she turned and rushed headlong up the stairs. Berg was sitting beside the countess, consoling her with the respectful attention of a relative. The count, pipe in hand, was pacing up and down the room, when Natásha, her face distorted by anger, burst in like a tempest and approached her mother with rapid steps. "It is horrid, it is abominable!" she screamed. "You can't possibly have ordered it." Berg and the countess looked at her, perplexed and frightened. The count stood still at the window and listened. "Mamma, it is impossible! See what is going on in the yard!" she cried. "They will be left. What's the matter with you? Who are they? What do you want?" "Why, the wounded! It is impossible, Mamma! It is monstrous! No, Mamma, darling, is not the thing. Please forgive me, darling Mamma. What does it matter what we take away? Only look what is going on in the yard. Mamma, it is impossible." The count stood by the window and listened without turning round. Suddenly he sniffed and put his face closer to the window. The countess glanced at her daughter, saw her face full of shame for her mother, saw her agitation, and understood why her husband did not turn to look at her now, and she glanced round quite disconcerted. "Oh, do as you like. Am I hindering anyone?" she said, not surrendering at once. "Mamma, darling, forgive me." But the countess pushed her daughter away and went up to her husband. "My dear, you order what is right. You know I don't understand about it," said she, dropping her eyes shamefacedly. The eggs are teaching the hen," muttered the count through tears of joy, and he embraced his wife, who was glad to hide her look of shame on his breast. "Papa, Mamma, may I see to it? May I?" asked Natásha. "We will still take all the most necessary things." The count nodded affirmatively, and Natásha, at the rapid pace at which she used to run when playing at tag, ran through the ballroom to the anteroom and downstairs into the yard. The servants gathered round Natásha, but could not believe the strange order she brought them, until the count himself, in his wife's name, confirmed the order to give up all the carts to the wounded and take the trunks to the storerooms. When they understood that order, the servants set to work at this new task with pleasure and zeal. It no longer seemed strange to them, but on the contrary, it seemed the only thing that could be done, just as a quarter of an hour before it had not seemed strange to anyone that the wounded should be left behind and the goods carted away, but that had seemed the only thing to do. The whole household, as if to atone for not having done it sooner, set eagerly to work at the new task of placing the wounded in the carts. The wounded dragged themselves out of their rooms and stood with pale but happy faces round the carts. The news that carts were to be had spread to the neighboring houses, from which wounded men began to come into the Rostovs' yard. Many of the wounded asked them not to unload the carts, but only to let them sit on the top of the things. But the work of unloading, once started, could not be arrested. It seemed not to matter whether all or only half the things were left behind. Cases full of china, bronzes, pictures, and mirrors that had been so carefully packed the night before now lay about the yard, and still they went on searching for and finding possibilities of unloading this or that and letting the wounded have another and yet another cart. "We can take 4 more men," said the steward. "They can have my trap, or else what is to become of them?" "Let them have my wardrobe cart," said the countess. "Dunyásha can go with me in the carriage." They unloaded the wardrobe cart and sent it to take wounded men from a house 2 doors off. The whole household, servants included, was bright and animated. Natásha was in a state of rapturous excitement, such as she had not known for a long time. "What could we fasten this onto?" asked the servants, trying to fix a trunk on the narrow footboard behind the carriage. "We must keep at least 1 cart." "What is in it?" asked Natásha. "The count's books." "Leave it. Vasílich will put it away. It is not wanted." The phaeton was full of people, and there was a doubt as to where Count Peter could sit. "On the box. You will sit on the box, won't you, Pétya?" cried Natásha. Sónya too was busy all this time, but the aim of her efforts was quite different from Natásha's. She was putting away the things that had to be left behind and making a list of them as the countess wished, and she tried to get as much taken away with them as possible. End of chapter 16. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. War and Peace, Book 11, Chapter 17. Recording for LibriVox.org by Eva Harnick. Before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Rostovs' 4 carriages, packed full and with the horses harnessed, stood at the front door. One by one the carts with the wounded had moved out of the yard. The calèche in which Prince Andrew was being taken attracted Sónya's attention as it passed the front porch. With the help of a maid, she was arranging a seat for the countess in the huge high coach that stood at the entrance. "Whose calèche is that?" she inquired, leaning out of the carriage window. "Why, didn't you know, miss?" replied the maid. "The wounded prince, he spent the night in our house and is going with us." "But who is it? What is his name?" "It is our intended that was, Prince Bolkonsky himself. They say he's dying," replied the maid with a sigh. Sónya jumped out of the coach and ran to the countess. The countess, tired out and already dressed in shawl and bonnet for her journey, was pacing up and down the drawing-room, waiting for the household to assemble for the usual silent prayer with closed doors before starting. Natásha was not in the room. "Mamma," said Sónya, "Prince Andrew is here, mortally wounded. He's going with us." The countess opened her eyes in dismay and, seizing Sónya's arm, glanced around. "Natásha?" she murmured. At that moment this news had only one significance for both of them. They knew their Natásha, and alarm as to what would happen if she heard this news stifled all sympathy for the man they both liked. "Natásha does not know yet, but he is going with us," said Sónya. "You say he is dying?" Sónya nodded. The countess put her arms around Sónya and began to cry. "The ways of God are past finding out," she thought, feeling that the almighty hand, hitherto unseen, was becoming manifest in all that was now taking place. "Well, Mamma, everything is ready. What's the matter?" asked Natásha, as with animated face she ran into the room. "Nothing," answered the countess. "If everything is ready, let us start." And the countess bent over her reticule to hide her agitated face. Sónya embraced Natásha and kissed her. Natásha looked at her inquiringly. "What is it? What has happened?" "Nothing." "No." "Is it something very bad for me? What is it?" persisted Natásha with her quick intuition. Sónya sighed and made no reply. The count, Pétya, Madame Schoss, Mávra Kuzmínichna, and Vasílich came into the drawing-room, and, having closed the doors, they all sat down and remained for some moments silently seated without looking at one another. The count was the first to rise, and with a loud sigh crossed himself before the icon. All the others did the same. Then the count embraced Mávra Kuzmínichna and Vasílich, who were to remain in Moscow, and while they caught at his hand and kissed his shoulder, he patted their backs lightly with some vaguely affectionate and comforting words. The countess went into the oratory, and there Sónya found her on her knees before the icons that had been left here and there hanging on the wall. The most precious ones, with which some family tradition was connected, were being taken with them. In the porch and in the yard the men whom Pétya had armed with swords and daggers, with trousers tucked inside their high boots and with belts and girdles tightened, were taking leave of those remaining behind. As is always the case at a departure, much had been forgotten or put in the wrong place, and for a long time two men-servants stood one on each side of the open door and the carriage steps, waiting to help the countess in, while maids rushed with cushions and bundles from the house to the carriages, the calèche, the phaeton, and back again. "They always will forget everything," said the countess. "Don't you know I can't sit like that?" And Dunyásha, with clenched teeth, without replying, but with an aggrieved look on her face, hastily got into the coach to rearrange the seat. "Oh, those servants!" said the count, swaying his head. Efim, the old coachman, who was the only one the countess trusted to drive her, sat perched up high on the box and did not so much as glance around at what was going on behind him. From 30 years' experience he knew it would be some time yet before the order, "Be off in God's name," would be given him. And he knew that even when it was said, he would be stopped once or twice more while they sent back to fetch something that had been forgotten, and even after that he would again be stopped, and the countess herself would lean out of the window and beg him for the love of heaven to drive carefully down the hill. He knew all this, and therefore waited calmly for what would happen, with more patience than the horses, especially the near one, the chestnut falcon, who was pawing the ground and chomping his bit. At last all were seated, the carriage steps were folded and pulled up, the door was shut, somebody was sent for a traveling case, and the countess leaned out and said what she had to say. Then Efim deliberately doffed his hat and began crossing himself. The postilion and all the other servants did the same. "Off in God's name," said Efim, putting on his hat. "Start!" The postilion started the horses. The off-pole horse tugged at his collar, the high springs creaked, and the body of the coach swayed. The footman sprang onto the box of the moving coach, which jolted as it passed out of the yard onto the uneven roadway. The other vehicles jolted in their turn, and the procession of carriages moved up the street. In the carriages the calèche and the phaeton all crossed themselves as they passed the church opposite the house. Those who were to remain in Moscow walked on either side of the vehicles, seeing the travelers off. Rarely had Natásha experienced so joyful a feeling as now, sitting in the carriage beside the countess and gazing at the slowly receding walls of forsaken, agitated Moscow. Occasionally she leaned out of the carriage window and looked back and then forward at the long train of wounded in front of them. Almost at the head of the line she could see the raised hood of Prince Andrew's calèche. She did not know who was in it, but each time she looked at the procession her eyes sought that calèche. She knew it was right in front. In Kudrino, from the Nikitsky, Presnya and Podnovinsk streets came several other trains of vehicles similar to the Rostovs, and as they passed along the Sadovaya street, the carriages and carts formed 2 rows abreast. As they were going round the Sukharev water tower, Natásha, who was inquisitively and alertly scrutinizing the people driving or walking past, suddenly cried out in joyful surprise, "Dear me, Mamma! Sónya, look, it is he!" "Who? Who?" "Look! Yes, on my word, it is Bezúkhov," said Natásha, putting her head out of the carriage and staring at a tall, stout man in a coachman's long coat, who from his manner of walking and moving was evidently a gentleman in disguise, and who was passing under the arch of the Sukharev tower, accompanied by a small, sallow-faced, beardless old man in a frieze coat. Yes, it really is Bezúkhov in a coachman's coat, with a queer-looking old boy. "Really," said Natásha. "Look, look!" "No, it isn't he. How can you talk such nonsense?" "Mamma!" screamed Natásha. "I will stake my head it is he, I assure you," "Stop, stop!" she cried to the coachman. But the coachman could not stop, for from the Meshchansky Street came more carts and carriages, and the Rostovs were being shouted at to move on and not block the way. In fact, however, though now much farther off than before, the Rostovs all saw Pierre, or someone extraordinarily like him, in a coachman's coat, going down the street with head bent and a serious face, beside a small, beardless old man who looked like a footman. That old man noticed a face thrust out of the carriage window, gazing at them, and respectfully touching Pierre's elbow, said something to him and pointed to the carriage. Pierre, evidently engrossed in thought, could not at first understand him. At length, when he had understood and looked in the direction the old man indicated, he recognized Natásha, and following his first impulse, stepped instantly and rapidly toward the coach. But having taken a dozen steps, he seemed to remember something and stopped. Natásha's face, leaning out of the window, beamed with quizzical kindliness. "Peter Kirílovich, come here! We have recognized you. This is wonderful!" she cried, holding out her hand to him. "What are you doing? Why are you like this?" Pierre took her outstretched hand and kissed it awkwardly as he walked along beside her while the coach still moved on. "What is the matter, Count?" asked the countess in a surprised and commiserating tone. "What? Why? Don't ask me," said Pierre, and looked round at Natásha, whose radiant, happy expression, of which he was conscious without looking at her, filled him with enchantment. "Are you remaining in Moscow, then?" Pierre hesitated. "In Moscow?" he said in a questioning tone. "Yes, in Moscow. Goodbye." "Ah, if only I were a man, I would certainly stay with you." "How splendid!" said Natásha. "Mamma, if you will let me, I will stay." Pierre glanced absently at Natásha and was about to say something, but the countess interrupted him. "You were at the battle, we heard." "Yes, I was," Pierre answered. "There will be another battle tomorrow," he began, but Natásha interrupted him. "But what is the matter with you, Count? You are not like yourself." "Oh, don't ask me, don't ask me. I don't know myself. Tomorrow... But no, goodbye, goodbye," he muttered. "It is an awful time." And dropping behind the carriage, he stepped onto the pavement. Natásha continued to lean out of the window for a long time, beaming at him with her kindly, slightly quizzical, happy smile. End of chapter 17. Recording by Eva Harnick, Pontevedra, Florida.
War and Peace, Book 11, Chapter 18. Read for LibriVox.org by Jeff. Chapter 18. For the last 2 days, ever since leaving home, Pierre had been living in the empty house of his deceased benefactor, Bazadiv. This is how it happened. When he woke up on the morning after his return to Moscow and his interview with Count Rostovshin, he could not for some time make out where he was and what was expected of him. When he was informed that among others awaiting him in his reception room, there was a Frenchman who had brought a letter from his wife, the Countess Helene. He felt suddenly overcome by that sense of confusion and hopelessness to which he was up to scorn. He felt that everything was now at an end, and all was in confusion and crumbling to pieces, that nobody was right or wrong, the future held nothing, and there was no escape from this position. Smiling unnaturally and muttering to himself, he first sat down on the sofa in an attitude of despair, then rose, went to the door of the reception-room and peeped through the crack, returned flourishing his arms, and took up a book. His major-domo came in a second time to say that the Frenchman who had brought the letter from the Countess was very anxious to see him, if only for a minute, and that someone from Bazadev's widow had called to ask Pierre to take charge of her husband's book, as she herself was leaving for the country. "Oh yes, in a minute. Wait. Or no, of course. Go and say I will come directly," Pierre replied to the major-domo. But as soon as the man had left the room, Pierre took up his hat which was lying on the table, and went out of his study-room by the other door. There was no one in the passage. He went along the whole length of this passage to the stairs, and frowning and rubbing his forehead with both hands, went down as far as the first landing. The hall porter was standing at the front door. From the landing where Pierre stood there was a second staircase leading to the back entrance. He went down that staircase and out into the yard. No one had seen him, but there were some carriages waiting, and as soon as Pierre stepped out of the gate, the coachman and the yard porter noticed him and raised their caps to him. When he felt that he was being looked at, he behaved like an ostrich, which hid its head in a bush in order not to be seen. He hung his head, and quickening his pace went down the street. Of all the affairs waiting Pierre that day, the sorting of Joseph Bazadev's book and the papers appeared to him the most necessary. He hired the first cab he met and told the driver to go to the Patriarch's Ponds where the widow Bazadev's house was. Continually turning around to look at the rows of loaded cars that were making their way from all sides out of Moscow, and balancing his bulky body so as not to slip out of the ramshackle old vehicle, Pierre, experiencing the joyful feeling of a boy escaping from school, began to talk to his driver. The man told him that the arms were being distributed today at the Kremlin, and that tomorrow everyone would be sent out beyond the Three Hills gates, and a great battle would be fought there. Having reached the Patriarch's Ponds, Pierre found the Bazadev's house, where he had not been for a long time past. He went up to the gate. Gerasim, that shallow beardless old man Pierre had seen at Tolstoy 5 years before with Joseph Bazadev, came out in answer to his knock. "Owing to the present state of things, Sofia Danielovna has gone to the Tozok estate with the children, Your Excellency. Sofia Danielovna has gone to the Tozok estate. Sofia Danielovna has gone to the Tozok estate with the children, Sofia Danielovna has gone to the Tozok estate with the children, Your Excellency. I will come in all the same. I have to look through the books," said Pierre. "Be so good as to step in, Mark Alexeyevich, the brother of my late master. May the kingdom of heaven be his, has remained here. But he is a weak state, as you know," said the old servant. Pierre knew that Mark Alexeyevich was Joseph Bazadev's half-insane brother and a hard drinker. Yes, I know. Let us go in," said Pierre, and entered the house. A tall, bald-headed old man with a red nose, wearing the dressing gown, and with a tall, bald-headed old man with a red nose, wearing a dressing gown, and with glasses on his bare feet, stood in the ante-room. On seeing Pierre, he muttered something angrily, and went away along the passage. "He was a very clever man, but has now grown quite feeble, as your honor sees." He was a very clever man, but has now grown quite feeble, as your honor sees," said Gerasim. "Will you step into the study?" Pierre nodded. As it was sealed up, so it has remained. But Sofia Danilovna gave orders that if anyone should come from you, they were to have the books. Pierre went into that gloomy study, which he had entered with such trepidation in his benefactor's lifetime. The room, dusty and untouched since the death of Joseph Bazadiv, was now even gloomier. Gerasim opened one of the shutters and left the room on tiptoe. Pierre went around the study, approached the cupboard in which the manuscripts were kept, and took out what had once been one of the most important and the holy of holies of the order. This was the authentic Scotch axe, with Bazadiv's notes and explanations. He sat down at the dusty writing table, and having laid the manuscript before him, opened them out, closed them, finally pushed them away, and resting his head on his hand sank into meditation. Gerasim looked cautiously into the study several times, and saw Pierre always sitting in the same attitude. More than 2 hours passed, and Gerasim took the liberty of making a slight noise at the door to attract his attention, but Pierre did not hear him. "Is the cabman to be discharged, your honor?" "Oh yes," said Pierre, rousing himself and rising hurriedly. "Look here," taking Gerasim by a button of his coat, and looking down at the old man with moist, shining, and exacting eyes. And Gerasim heard him pacing restlessly from one corner to another and talking to himself, and he spent the night on a bed made up for him there. Gerasim, being a servant who in his time had seen many strange things, accepted Pierre's taking up his residence in the house without surprise, and seemed pleased to have someone to wait on. That same evening, without even asking himself what they were wanted for, he procured a coachman's coat and a cap for Pierre, and promised to get him the pistol next day. Makar Alexeyevich came twice that evening, shuffling along in his galoshes as far as the door, and stopped and looked ingratiatingly at Pierre. But as soon as Pierre turned toward him, he wrapped his dressing gown around him with a shamefaced and angry look, and hurried away. It was when Pierre, wearing the coachman's coat, which Gerasim had procured for him and had disinfected by steam, was on his way with the old man to buy the pistol at the Sakharov market that he met the Rostovs. End of chapter 18. War and Peace, Book 11, Chapter 19. Read for LibriVox.org by Jeff. Chapter 19. Kutuzov's order to retreat through Moscow at the Rising Road was issued at night on the 1st of September. The first troops started at once, and during the night they marched slowly and steadily without hurry. At daybreak, however, those nearing the town at the Dargomalev bridge saw ahead of them masses of soldiers crowding and hurrying across the bridge, ascending on the opposite side and blocking the streets and alleys, while endless masses of troops were bearing down on them from behind. And an unreasoning hurry and alarm overcame them. They all rushed forward to the bridge, onto it, and to the forts and the boats. Kutuzov himself had driven round by side streets to the other side of Moscow. By 10 o'clock in the morning of the 2nd of September, only the rear guard remained in the Dargomalev suburb, where they had ample room. The main army was on the other side of Moscow or beyond it. At that very time, at 10 in the morning of the 2nd of September, Napoleon was standing among his troops on the Poklony Hill, looking at the panorama spread out before him. From the 26th of August to the 2nd of September, that is, from the Battle of Borodino to the entry of the French into Moscow. During the whole of that agitating memorable week, there had been the extraordinary autumn weather that always comes as a surprise, when the sun hangs low and gives more heat than in spring, when everything shines so brightly in the real clear atmosphere that the eye smarts, when the lungs are strengthened and refreshed by inhaling the aromatic autumn air, when even the nights are warm, and when in those dark, warm nights, golden stars startle and delight us continually by falling from the sky. At 10 in the morning of the 2nd of September, this weather still held.
The brightness of the morning was magical.
Moscow, seen from the Poklony Hill, lay spaciously, spread out with her river, her gardens, and her churches, and she seemed to be living her usual life, the cupolas glittering like stars in the sunlight. The view of the strange city with its peculiar architecture, such as he had never seen before, filled Napoleon with his rather envious and uneasy curiosity men feel when they see an alien form of life that has no knowledge of them. This city was evidently living with the full force of its own life, by the indefinite signs which, even at a distance, distinguish a living body from a dead one. Napoleon from the Poklony Hill perceived the throb of life in the town, and felt, as it were, the breathing of that great and beautiful body. Every Russian looking at Moscow feels her to be a mother. Every foreigner who sees her, even if ignorant of her significance as the mother city, must feel her feminine character, and Napoleon feels it. That Asiatic city of the innumerable churches, holy Moscow, here it is, then at last, the famous city. It was high time, said he, and dismounting, he ordered the plain of Moscow to be spread out before him, and summoned Lalorny the Devil, the interpreter. A town captured by the enemy is like a maid who has lost her honor, thought he. He had said so to Tarkov at Smolensk. From that point of view, he gazed at the oriental beauty he had not seen before. It seemed strange to him that his long-felt wish, which had seemed unattainable, had at last been realized. In the clear morning light, he gazed now at the city and now at the plain, considering its details, and the assurance of possessing it agitated and awed him. But could it be otherwise, he thought. Here is the capital at my feet. Where is Alexander now, and of what is he thinking? A strange, beautiful, and majestic city, and a strange and majestic moment. In what light must I appear to them, thought he, thinking of his troops. Here she is, the reward for all those faint-hearted men, he reflected, glancing at those near him and at the troop who were approaching and forming up. One word from me, one movement of my hand, and that ancient capital of the Tsars would perish. But my clemency is always ready to descend upon the vanquished. It must be magnanimous and truly great. But no, it can't be true that I am in Moscow, he suddenly thought. Yet here she is lying at my feet, with her golden domes and crosses, scintillating and twinkling in the sunshine. But I shall spare her. On the ancient monuments of barbarism and despotism, I will inscribe great words of justice and mercy. It is just this Alexander will feel most painfully. I know him. It seemed to Napoleon that the chief import of what was taking place lay in the personal struggle between himself and Alexander. From the height of the Kremlin, yes, there is the Kremlin. Yes, I will give them just laws. I will teach them the meaning of true civilization. I will make generations of boyars remember their conqueror with love. I will tell the deputation that I did not and do not desire war, that I've waged the war only against the false policy of their court, that I love and respect Alexander, and that in Moscow I will accept terms of peace worthy of myself and of my people. I do not wish to utilize the fortunes of war to humiliate and honor the monarch. Boyars, I will say to them, I do not desire war. I desire the peace and welfare of my subjects. However, I know their presence will inspire me, and I shall speak to them as I always do, clearly, impressively, and majestically. But can it be true that I am in Moscow? Yes, there she lies.
"Bring the boyars to me," said he to his suite.
A general with a brilliant suite galloped off at once to fetch the boyars. 2 hours passed. Napoleon had lunch, and was again standing in the same place on the Poklony Hill, awaiting the deputation. His speech to the boyars had already taken definite shape in his imagination. That the speech was full of dignity and greatness as Napoleon understood it. He was himself carried away by the tone of magnanimity he intended to adopt toward Moscow. In his imagination, he appointed days for assemblies at the palace of the Tsars, at which Russian notables and his own would mingle. He mentally appointed a governor, one who would win the hearts of the people. Having learned that there were many charitable institutions in Moscow, he mentally decided that he would shower favor on them all. He thought that as in Africa, he had to put on a burnous and sit in a mosque. He must be beneficent like the Tsars. And in order to finally to touch the hearts of the Russians, and being like all Frenchmen unable to imagine anything sentimental without a reference to Marshal, Matenda, Mapova Mia, he decided that he would place an inscription on all these establishments in large letters. "This establishment is dedicated to my dear mother." Or no, it should be simply Maison de ma Mia, he concluded. "But am I really in Moscow? Yes, here it lies before me. But why is the deputation from the city so long in appearing?" he wondered. Meanwhile, an agitated consultation was being carried on in whispers among his general and marshals, at the rear of his suite. Those sent to fetch the deputation had returned with the news that the Moscow was empty, that everyone had left it. The faces of those who were not conferring together were pale and perturbed. They were not alarmed by the fact that Moscow had been abandoned by its inhabitants, grave as the fact seemed, but by the question how to tell the emperor, without putting him in the terrible position of appearing ridiculous, that he had been waiting the boyars so long in vain, that there were drunk mobs left in Moscow but no one else. Some said that a deputation of some sort must be scraped together. Others disputed that opinion, and maintained that the emperor should first be carefully and skillfully prepared, and then told the truth. "He will have to be told, all the same," said some gentlemen of the suite. But, gentlemen, the position was the more awkward because the emperor, meditating upon his magnanimous plans, was pacing patiently up and down before the outspread map, occasionally glancing along the road to Moscow from under his lifted hand with a bright and proud smile. "But it's impossible," declared the gentlemen of the suite, shrugging their shoulders, but not venturing to utter the impolite word of ridicule. At last the emperor, tired of futile expectation, his actor's instinct suggesting to him that the sublime moment had been too long drawn out, was beginning to lose its sublimity, gave a sign with his hand. A single report of the signaling gun followed, and the troops who were already spread out on different sides of Moscow moved into the city through Ver, Kaluga, and Dargamolev gates, faster and faster, vying with one another. They moved at the double or at a trot, vanishing amid the clouds of dust. They raced and making the air ring with a deafening roll of mingled shots. Joined on by the movement of his troops, Napoleon rode with them as far as the Dargamolev gate, but there again stopped, and dismounting from his horse, paced for a long time by the Kamer-Kolesky rampart, awaiting the deputation.
End of chapter 19.
Book 11, Chapter 20. Read for LibriVox.org by Harry Inc. Meanwhile, Moscow was empty. There were still people in it. Perhaps a 50th part of its former inhabitants had remained, but it was empty. It was empty in the sense that a dying, queenless hive is empty. In a queenless hive no life is left, though to a superficial glance it seems as much alive as other hives. The bees circle around a queenless hive in the hot beams of the midday sun as gaily as around the living hives. From a distance it smells of honey, like the others, and bees fly in and out in the same way. But one only has to observe that hive to realize that there is no longer any life in it. The bees do not fly in the same way. The smell and the sound that meet the beekeeper are not the same. To the beekeeper's tap on the wall of the sick hive, instead of the former instant unanimous humming of tens of thousands of bees with their abdomens threateningly compressed, and producing by the rapid vibration of their wings an aerial living sound, the only reply is a disconnected buzzing from different parts of the deserted hive. From the alighting board, instead of the former spirituous fragrant smell of honey and venom, and the warm whiffs of crowded life, come an odour of emptiness and decay, mingling with the smells of honey. There are no longer sentinels sounding alarm with their abdomens raised and ready to die in defence of the hive. There is no longer the measured quiet sound of throbbing activity like the sound of boiling water, but diverse, discordant sounds of disorder. In and out of the hive, long black robber bees smeared with honey fly timidly and shiftily. They do not sting, but they crawl away from danger. Formerly only bees laden with honey flew into the hive, and they flew out empty. Now they fly out laden. The beekeeper opens the lower part of the hive and peers in. Instead of black, glossy bees, tamed by toil, clinging to one another's legs and drawing out the wax, with a ceaseless hum of labour that used to hang in long clusters down to the floor of the hive, drowsy, shrivelled bees crawl about separately in various directions on the floor and the walls of the hive. Instead of a neatly glued floor swept by the bees with the fanning of their wings, there is a floor littered with bits of wax, excrement, dying bees scarcely moving their legs, and dead ones that have not been cleared away. The beekeeper opens the upper part of the hive and examines the super. Instead of serried rows of bees sealing up every gap in the combs and keeping the brood warm, he sees the skilful complex structures of the combs, but no longer in their former state of purity. All is neglected and foul. Black robber bees are swiftly and stealthily prowling about the combs, and the short home bees, shrivelled and listless as if they were old, creep slowly about without trying to hinder the robbers, having lost all motive and all sense of life. Drones, bumblebees, wasps and butterflies knock awkwardly against the wall of the hive in their flight. Here and there among the cells containing dead brood and honey, an angry buzzing can sometimes be heard. Here and there a couple of bees, by force of habit and custom, cleaning out the brood cells, with efforts beyond their strength laboriously drag away a dead bee or a bumblebee, without knowing why they do it. In another corner 2 old bees are languidly fighting, or cleaning themselves, or feeding one another, without themselves knowing whether they do it with a friendly or hostile intent. In a third place, a crowd of bees crushing one another attack some victim and fight and smother it, and the victim, enfeebled or killed, drops from above slowly and lightly as a feather among the heap of corpses. The keeper opens the 2 centre partitions to examine the brood cells. In place of the former close, dark circles formed by thousands of bees sitting back to back and guarding the high mystery of generation, he sees hundreds of dull, listless and sleeping shells of bees. They have almost all died unawares, sitting in the sanctuary they had guarded and which is now no more. They reek of decay and death. Only a few of them still move, rise, and feebly fly to settle on the enemy's hand, lacking the spirit to die, stinging him. The rest are dead and fall as lightly as fish scales. The beekeeper closes the hive, chalks a mark on it, and when he has time, tears out its contents and burns it clean. So, in the same way, Moscow was empty when Napoleon, weary, uneasy, and morose, paced up and down in front of the Kama-Kozletsky rampart, awaiting what, to his mind, was a necessary, if but formal, observance of the proprieties, a deputation. In various corners of Moscow there still remained a few people aimlessly moving about, but following their old habits and hardly aware of what they were doing. When, with due circumspection, Napoleon was informed that Moscow was empty, he looked angrily at his informant, turned away, and silently continued to walk to and fro. "My carriage," he said. He took his seat beside the aide-de-camp on duty and drove into the suburb. "Moscow is deserted," he said to himself. "What an incredible event!" He did not drive into the town, but put up at an inn in the Dorogomilov suburb. The coup de théâtre had not come off. End of chapter 20. Recording by Harry Inc., Melbourne, Australia.